I was 9 this summer. We moved to Kettle Hill, a quiet Oregon town wrapped in pine trees and silence where time didn't pass so much as it stalled in the gaps. Between buzzing insects, whispering leaves, and the faint hum of forgotten lives, lingering just below the surface of normalcy, as if it were trying to escape something quietly through the soil. And while my parents unpacked boxes and argued about paint colors and what belonged in which room, I spent most of my days alone with a battered black and white Zenith TV. In my bedroom, a relic with a dial tuner and rabbit ear antennas that only picked up a handful of local channels, each filled with soap operas, farm reports, or reruns of cartoons I had already memorized. And in that hushed, dust-smeared atmosphere of a town that had long since stopped expecting visitors, I found something I was never supposed to see. The house we moved into was old and tilted slightly downhill, swinging just enough to make the shadows feel like they were breathing. It was during one of those late afternoons, the sun half buried in the trees and the air outside vibrating with heat, that I turned the dial looking for something, anything to drown out the nothingness, when the screen crackled, blinked, and then very suddenly settled. There was no channel logo, no commercial, no music, only a grainy stationary image of a dimly lit room, illuminated by a single flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling like an old secret. The camera didn't move, and nothing happened for what felt like a full minute, until something did. A figure stepped slowly into the frame, tall and rigid, wearing what looked like a wooden mask carved crudely into the shape of a smiling face, with 2 hollow eye holes and painted lips that curved too high at the corners, shaping something that looked at first like a doll, then a puppet, then something else entirely. Something too abstract to be a toy, but too precise to be random. The kind of expression that would VIII made me laugh if it hadn't have felt so wrong in a way I didn't yet have words for. You see now, before the screen went black without warning. He wore a carpenter's apron, stained and stiff, and thick gloves that creaked when he flexed his fingers, and he walked with the mechanical calm of someone who had rehearsed every movement 1,000 times behind closed doors, someone who wasn't performing, but repeating. He faced the camera, tilted his head slightly to the side, and after a long pause, spoke. "Hello, children," he said, voice muffled as if it had to pass through wood and fabric and something else colder. "Welcome to the workshop." That was all. And then directly into the camera, like he was checking to make sure I was still watching. Then he turned, picked up a block of wood, and began carving. The sound was harsh blade against grain, deliberate and slow, and I couldn't look away, mesmerized by the way his gloved hands worked with near reverence. 20 minutes passed before he stopped. He lifted the object toward the camera, a figure with spindly limbs, button eyes, and what might have been scissors for wings, and whispered, "There." No credits. A marionette that never stopped nodding, a rabbit mask that blinked even though it had no eyelids, each one stranger than the last, and each one handled with the same strange tenderness. No fade, just static. The next day, I tuned in again at exactly the same time. And the Toymaker was there again, carving something new, humming softly, whispering words I couldn't make out, staring now. And though the image was as grainy as ever, I could read the writing the moment he raised it. "And if I choose you, you'll see it come to life." I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone. Somehow I knew I wasn't supposed to. This went on for weeks. Every weekday afternoon at 3:45, Channel 81 came alive. Just for me, or at least that's how it felt, and each day brought a new creation, a stitched-up bear with too many arms. Open scissor wings spreading from its back like something angelic and wrong. I named it Cicerangle, and I signed it Leo, all caps, trying to make it neat, like I wanted to impress someone watching from behind the page. Then one day in mid-August, everything changed. The Toymaker didn't begin the episode at his workbench. He was already in front of the camera, standing unnaturally still, holding a sheet of paper in both hands. P.O. Box 1907, Old Route 6, Kettle Hill, OR 97411. "I've received so many lovely letters," he said, and something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten, like the words were crawling through something wet and unseen before reaching the air. "If you want to visit the workshop," he continued, "send me a drawing. Tell me what you'd like me to build. Then he leaned close, so close I could see the wood grain on his mask, and whispered, "We'll make it breathe." The screen cut to black. I sat frozen for a while, then reached for paper. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just did. I drew a jack-in-the-box with a porcelain face, hollow black eyes, and a set of metallic. I dropped it in the mail the next morning. 5 days later, I found a letter slipped under my bedroom window. There was no stamp, no return address. Only heavy cardstock, thick enough to suggest it wasn't meant to bend. And inside was a message written in dark red ink with unnerving precision. And all we could hear was the crunch of our shoes on dead leaves and the sound of our own breath. Deeper into the woods than we had ever dared to walk before, until the road became dirt and the trees began to lean in. And we found the gate, or what was left of it, just a collapsed wooden frame covered in moss and rusted nails. "Dear Leo, your design was beautiful. I've made your toy. It is waiting. Come to the workshop. Sunday, 4 p.m. Come alone. The Toymaker." I showed it to Jamie, the only friend I had in town, the only person I trusted with something that didn't make sense. He didn't say anything. He just reached into his backpack and pulled out an identical envelope. We looked at each other, and without saying it out loud, we both knew we were going. That Sunday, we followed old Route 6 past the cracked pavement and rotting signs. Behind it was a narrow trail marked by crooked sticks and strands of twine, like someone had tried to build a spine from broken things and laid it across the forest floor. We followed it. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, until even the birdsong faded at the end of the trail. Half sunken into the earth like it had tried to bury itself but failed was the cabin. Its windows were dark. Its door was open. And we stepped inside. What we saw next would never let go. It had been 20 years since the day I stood in that clearing with Jamie. 20 years since the two of us crossed the threshold of a half-buried cabin at the edge of the woods and saw something so wrong, so precisely designed to slip under the skin of memory, the skeptical one, where a string of coincidences and the haze of trauma produced illusion. And the guilty one, where I remembered too well what had happened and chose silence instead of truth, and yet none of them prepared me for the moment. I walked down into the library as archive basement, into the cool, forgotten air of a room, filled with mold-stained boxes and rows of analog media that hadn't been touched in over a decade, and saw the tape, which I almost hoped would last forever until it flickered, warped, and pulled into focus. And there it was again. That even now, after 1,000 half-slept nights and a career built on documenting the strange I still couldn't quite decide whether we had survived it or simply escaped it by accident. But the screen gave it back to me sharper, darker, more deliberate. The swaying bulb above the workbench still threw restless shadows across the floor like they were trying to crawl away from what they already knew was coming, and the walls, though bare, somehow seemed heavier, like they were filled with something breathing just beneath the surface of the grain, as if no time had passed at all. Unlabeled, as if it had wandered there on its own and waited patiently for someone who recognized it. And when I picked it up, I felt the weight of it, not just the plastic shell, but the gravity of memory bending around it, and saw the faded handwriting along the spine, shaky and red, smudged in places but unmistakable. I was alone in a dimly lit space with a humming CRT. And when he turned to face the camera, I felt my throat tighten, like my body remembered something my brain was trying to forget. AVC are older than I was, and the kind of silence you only notice when you realize you've stopped breathing. By the time I returned to Kettle Hill, I had already told myself every possible version of the story, the innocent one, where childhood fear turned ordinary events into nightmare. It wasn't hidden, not exactly. Just resting inside a battered cardboard tray marked Local Broadcast Misc, W81_Septo3_ to final, me. But upright, their faces blurred by the grain. And yet one detail cut through it all with a precision I couldn't explain: the red hoodie. Preserved perfectly in magnetic tape, like it had always known I would come back. I stood there too long, holding it like a relic, heart pounding like the name on the label had tapped against a part of my skull I had boarded shut. No one questioned me when I asked for a private viewing room, small-town hospitality. Or maybe just the kind of hush that surrounds anyone who speaks softly and carries old ghosts in their voice, and within minutes. The tape hissed softly as it slid into the machine, and for a moment, the screen showed only the swirling static of blank signal, and topped with a lid that looked like it had been pried open more times than it was meant to. The workshop, unchanged. The room was exactly as I remembered it, and yet stranger now, because memory always rounds the corners of fear. And then, from the right side of the frame, he appeared. The Toymaker, exactly the same. Hollow eyes, scissor wings, spread wide like it was preparing to cut the air itself. And he turned the box toward the camera with a kind of pride that made me feel physically sick. Not older, not aged, not even weathered, as if time itself had avoided him out of fear. As if the mask he wore had frozen everything inside and outside him into one long continuous moment that never stopped unfolding. He walked into frame with the same measured steps, the same stiff gloves, the same wooden face that smiled too wide and never blinked and cut to black, leaving only the soft hum of tape running without image. Then he said it. In that soft, muffled voice that scraped somewhere between a whisper and a warning, he said, "Still watching, Leo? My name?" He said my name. Not children, not boys and girls. Me, parked behind a tool shed I hadn't seen since childhood, and dug a hole with my bare hands until the soil tore my skin and the air felt thinner. I saw the silhouette of a wooden mask flicker across the screen like the ghost of a signal that had never stopped broadcasting, and stood in the dark room, holding it like it might catch fire if I let go. And in that moment, something twisted inside me, not fear, not exactly, but the sudden recognition that what I had always thought was fiction, or trauma, or madness, had been waiting patiently in a format I had abandoned. He turned then slowly and raised his gloved hand toward the shadows behind him. And as the image adjusted, lines of static crawling across the screen like flies, I saw them. Children, 6, maybe 7, barely visible in the flickering light, standing motionless near the wall, their bodies slack. It was Jamie's. Even through the distortion, even across 20 years of fading memory and failed logic, I knew it with the kind of certainty that stops your heart for a moment and rearranges your past. The child wearing it didn't move. None of them did. But the Toymaker moved closer, lifting something from the bench, a small box painted in swirling reds and blacks, carved with intricate patterns. He set it down gently. He cranked the handle, and the music that came out was the same tune I had heard in my dreams for years, without knowing where it came from. It played slowly, unevenly, like it had been warped by heat or damp or something worse. And when the lid opened, the figure that popped up was Cicerangel, exactly as I had drawn it, porcelain face. "You forgot to finish it," he said, still smiling. So I did. The screen held for a moment, just long enough for me to feel like something was staring back, and then the footage stuttered, warped. I didn't pause it. I didn't rewind. I didn't eject. I just pulled the plug from the wall, pulled the tape from the machine. I walked out of the library, without a word, drove to the edge of town where the trees still leaned too far over the road. I buried the tape 6 feet down and packed the dirt until it no longer looked disturbed. But the disturbance followed me. That night, in the motel room on the outskirts of town, the TV turned itself on at exactly 3:45 a.m., and through the grainy veil of static, and in that flicker, just before I pulled the plug, I swear I heard him again. Soft, patient. "You're still watching." By the time I got back to Portland, the sky had turned the color of dirty porcelain, smeared with long streaks of cloud that looked like they'd been dragged by something heavy, and though the freeway was empty, the silence inside the car felt crowded, like the tape I had buried hadn't stayed underground, but instead crawled into the glove compartment. One of those places where the walls are thin and the air smells like wet carpet and time that has been bottled too long. I could convince myself that none of it had followed me, that the Toymaker's voice, that flicker in the tape, and I thought that maybe if I could just sleep for a night. The children behind him and the hoodie that still hung in my memory, like a warning, were all just ghosts of an overworked mind digging, too deep into the past for a story that didn't want to be found, and was watching me breathe through its plastic casing, waiting for the right moment to whisper again. But there was no one I could trust with that sentence, not because it was dangerous on its own, but because I had no way to prove that it wasn't the beginning of something, or worse, that it wasn't the continuation of something I had tried too hard to forget. I checked into a cheap motel just outside the city, the kind of dark that exists behind closed eyes during nightmares full of movement you can quite see. But that night, as I lay in bed with the TV off and the curtains drawn, an email arrived. Even the crooked lamp I had knocked over once in the middle of the night after waking from a dream I still couldn't explain. Tilted slightly as if the camera had been placed under the bed, or worse, as if it was being held. No subject, no sender, until a shape appeared in the far corner, crawling slowly on all fours toward the bed, its proportions just off enough to confuse the eye, with limbs too long and joints that bent too far the wrong way, like a doll trying to remember how humans move. Just a single line of text, centered in the body like it had been typed by something that didn't care about punctuation, formatting, or the rules that normally apply to digital correspondence. The dolls remember. I stared at it for too long, unsure whether to laugh or scream or forward it to someone who might understand. Attached to the email was a file named Leo_room, MP4. I don't remember clicking it. It just started. And when I finally looked in the mirror, I saw nothing behind me, but my reflection looked slightly wrong, like the angle of my shoulders wasn't what I remembered, or like the room behind me had changed while I wasn't watching. And just as I moved to unplug it, a whisper cut through the noise, so faint I could have imagined it, but so familiar that my legs went cold. At first it was blackness, the kind that doesn't feel like the absence of light, but more like the presence of something else entirely. I couldn't hear it, but I knew what it was. Still watching. The video froze. No end screen, no error. Just the image locked in place. My childhood bedroom perfectly reconstructed. The same wallpaper with its faint star patterns, the desk with my initials carved into the edge, then a flicker, slow and shuddering, and the screen revealed a room. My room. But something was wrong. The lighting was too low, like someone had filmed through thick cloth, and the angle was from near the floor. Nothing moved at first, and the silence buzzed with the kind of frequency that makes your teeth itch. As it reached the edge of the frame, it turned. Its face wasn't made of plastic or wood, but something that looked too much like skin stretched over a frame that hadn't been built to hold it. And its eyes, if they could be called that, were too human. Not human-like. Human. The pupils focused on the camera with deliberate, knowing precision, and for one breathless moment, it smiled. Not a full smile, just the lips curling upward as if amused, like it had seen something funny on the other side of the screen and wanted me to laugh with it. And then it mouthed something. I hadn't touched the remote. I hadn't set a timer. I slammed the laptop shut and stumbled into the bathroom, where I vomited until my ribs ached and the bile tasted like old dust and static. It wasn't absence. It was waiting. I tried to sleep, but the silence was worse now. At 3:45 a.m., the TV in the room switched on. But there it was, humming low, screen filled with static so dense it pulsed like breathing. It was a reminder. Leo, we're still playing. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a greeting. The drive to Salem was slow and gray, not because of the weather, though the sky hung low with that dull Pacific weight that makes the day feel like it's holding its breath, but because every exit sign, every stretch of highway lined with skeletal pine trees, seemed to peel something open in me, not memory exactly, but something deeper and colder that didn't have words. something that had been sleeping for 20 years and now stirred at the mention of Jamie's name. And I told him I was making a documentary about analog horror, those late-night local access shows, urban myths, signal hijackings, and when I mentioned Channel 81, he didn't blink or scoff or pretend not to remember. I hadn't spoken to Jamie's older brother since we were kids back, when he was the sullen, silent teen who smoked behind the bleachers and barely nodded when I said hello and when he opened the door to his duplex in South Salem. He looked like someone who had spent his entire adulthood trying to hammer grief into something quiet and manageable, only to find that it kept bleeding through the seams anyway. We sat in his cramped kitchen while his daughter napped in the next room, yet still impossibly intact in layout and lighting, as if someone had been preserving it, not out of nostalgia but for the purpose of performance. And he never showed it to police or family or anyone. Not because he was hiding something, but because the moment he watched it, he knew no one else would ever believe it hadn't come from a nightmare or a hoax or worse from somewhere that didn't follow the same rules the rest of us do. But emptied, as if whatever had once animated him had been scooped out and replaced with the mechanical stillness of a puppet waiting for its string. Instead, he stood up, opened a drawer next to the fridge, and pulled out a plain brown envelope sealed with thick, uneven tape, like someone had been afraid the contents might crawl out if they didn't bind it tight enough. His mouth opened, and he began to speak in a voice that sounded like it was being pushed out through layers of damp cloth and broken tape. The Toymaker appeared, not in the way people enter a scene, but in the way something is revealed once your eyes adjust, like he'd always been there, crouched and waiting. Impossibly intact, and every one of them seemed to follow Jamie as he lifted the puppet above his head and whispered something too faint to hear, showing a final frame of Jamie's face melting into the mask of the Toymaker, like they were the same thing all along. Face hidden behind the same mask, I remembered only now it looked older, more cracked, the paint peeling at the edges like something beneath it was trying to push through, leaving me alone in the garage with the smell of warm plastic and the echo of that whispered rhyme looping in my skull. He said he received it exactly 1 year after Jamie went missing. No return address, just his name written in perfect block letters across the front. It took me 2 hours to convince him to watch it again. Not in rhythm, not in jaw, just this slow, jerking movement, limbs twitching as if yanked by invisible wires. And as he swayed across the frame behind Jamie, I noticed the wall behind him was lined with jars, dozens of them, each glowing faintly from within. And as the camera panned ever so slightly to the right, I saw what was inside. He kept pacing, saying that he'd tried to forget the sound, the music, the smell. He swore came from the VCR itself when the tape began playing, like singed varnish and rotting wood and something sickly sweet beneath it. But eventually, with shaking hands and a face gone flat with resignation, he slid the tape into an old black JVC deck hooked up to a dusty television in the garage. And as the screen lit up with static that danced like tiny fingers, I realized I was holding my breath. The video opened on the workshop, not the one I remembered from the flickering broadcasts of my childhood, but something more decayed, like a stage, abandoned and reclaimed by mold and dust. And there he was, Jamie, standing center frame in a pool of muted yellow light, wearing the same striped hoodie he'd worn that summer, his face devoid of any expression, not blank. He was holding something in both hands, a marionette, small and precise, carved with uncanny resemblance to himself, right down to the mismatched shoelaces and the little freckle near his eye. And when he lifted his head to face the camera, wouldn't smile. Button soul. Sew me up and make me whole. His arms moved stiffly as he raised the puppet in front of him, letting its limbs dangle in mock surrender. And behind him, half shrouded in shadow, he began to dance. Eyes, single human eyes suspended in murky fluid, some wide with fear, others half-lidded in what looked like sleep, but all of them disturbingly real. At that moment, Jamie's brother made a sound, something between a gasp and a growl, and reached forward, with sudden violence, yanking the tape from the deck while the screen sputtered. He didn't speak after that, didn't explain. Just walked back into the house. When I stepped outside, the sky had gone dark, though I hadn't been there long enough for the sun to set. It had been more than 2 decades since I last set foot near Route 6, a place that once held the innocence of childhood. Exploration but now loomed like a scar on the edge of memory, and as I drove the winding back roads through the outskirts of Kettle Hill past rusted mailboxes and silent pine groves heavy with years of unspoken things, and I stood for nearly 10 minutes at the edge of it listening to the woods, breathe until I noticed the latch hidden beneath a tangled curtain of ivy cold to the touch and half-rusted shut, like a mouth clenched tight around a secret, no longer content to stay buried. I realized I wasn't so much heading toward a location as I was descending into the unfinished part of my own story, the chapter we never dared revisit, the one that ended not with resolution, but with fleeing footsteps and the breathless silence that followed. A foundation scorched black and skeletal under the waning light. Its timbers collapsed inward like a ribcage caved in around something that had once been alive, but had not died cleanly. And inscribed into its rusted face, uneven and jagged like it had been carved by small, shaking hands, were 5 words I wish I hadn't read aloud. And in the center, half buried in ash and soot and roots that curled like fingers, was a door, not a front entrance, not a cellar hatch, but an iron trapdoor, circular and ancient-looking, like something meant to stay sealed forever. My phone vibrated violently in my pocket, screen blinking despite the dead battery, like he was reminding me of a promise I never made, but broke anyway. And then he said it calm, measured, like he was proud, and I answered without thinking, without speaking, because deep down I already knew whose voice would be on the other end. Don't come down here. There was no gate anymore, no wooden archway with its painted sign, reading Workshop 81, in peeling red, no path we could follow like before. Just a thicket of overgrowth where the forest had reclaimed what was once carved open. The moment it clicked open, I stepped past the threshold, and it was as if I had crossed into a pocket of air that hadn't shifted in years, a hush that pressed against my skin, like water, where even the birds refused to sing and the wind moved with the reluctance of something watched. And though the sun still hung above the trees, the forest felt dim, steeped in a twilight that arrived hours too soon. I walked for what felt like miles, though my phone insisted it was only 40 minutes. The signal gone and the screen flickering with low battery, even though I'd charged it that morning, and all the while beneath the crunch of dead leaves and snapping twigs there was another sound so faint it barely reached the edge of hearing, something like music, like the remnants of a lullaby played on warped tape, warbling and stretched and full of holes. The kind of melody you don't remember hearing but find yourself humming all the same. Eventually, the trees opened into a clearing where time had tried and failed to erase what had once stood there, the workshop, or rather the skeletal remains of it. It was cold when I touched it, colder than metal should be in the warm soil. Dolls don't die, they wait. My fingers recoiled, heart jackhammering against my ribs, but before I could step back, it was Jamie. Older, quieter, cracked with something more than time. And he said my name in a way that felt less like recognition and more like accusation. I made my toy, Leo. He's perfect now. The line went dead before I could respond, but I stood there, motionless, listening to the static that lingered just long enough to feel like breathing. Leo hadn't expected the archivist to respond. He had typed the request half out of desperation, half as a joke, assuming anything connected to a local pirate broadcast from 2003 would have vanished in the bureaucratic void of paper trails that led nowhere. But then 3 days later he received a plain manila envelope without a return, address marked only with the number 81 written in ballpoint pen. And inside were documents that didn't look like they'd ever pass through public hands, photocopies of FCC signal detection logs. What made Leo's stomach knot into something primal and sick wasn't the technical precision of it all. Hand-marked with red grease pencil, alongside a brief, unsigned memo that read, "Every signal beginning at 4 p.m. and terminating at precisely 5 p.m. without variation. And although the field agents had noted the coordinates of origin as approx 451,736 N, 1,223,718 W, each with a line drawn through the neck like a hinge, and Leo remembered absolutely, viscerally remembered, drawing that exact picture on construction paper during class in 2nd grade, taping it to the inside of his school locker. Each thread looping back to that channel no one admitted existed, to broadcasts that no one officially recorded, to dolls that no one claimed to have made, and yet somehow every piece pointed to a central mechanism that had remained active even after the fire, even after the lake had frozen over, even after the hospital was torn down, something that didn't require wires or satellites or broadband towers to function, something that had always worked beneath everything else, humming like a forgotten machine wired into the bones of the town itself, and wondering how it had ended up in the possession of a man he had never met, whose name he didn't recognize, fell squarely beneath the center of Quarry Lake, the very lake where Jamie had supposedly drowned, the same lake where 2 decades ago. And it had nothing to do with technology or radiation or rogue transmission towers. It had always been analog, always been manual, always been the broadcast of a single will made visible through wood and static and memory, and the only question left was how far back it went, how deep it had been buried, and how many more children had tuned in without even knowing they'd made contact, but whose work seemed to exist behind everything he had begun to uncover. But the realization that the source, as mapped on his phone, Leo had seen a shape beneath the surface too smooth and too geometric to be natural, though no one had believed him at the time. Elwha, unauthorized analog signal, repeated emission pattern, geographic origin inconsistent with licensed infrastructure. Investigation suspended, no claimant, case closed. Leo's hands trembled slightly as he read the time logs. Exactly 81 transmissions, one each day between July 3rd and September 21st, 2003. Almost cropped out was a drawing tacked to the wall, a child's sketch in red crayon, of a stage labeled Workshop 81, with a smiling mask hovering above a row of tiny wooden dolls. Buried in the last few pages was a name he hadn't heard since childhood, though he couldn't place where he'd first come across it. Howard, listed in an incident report tied to a fire on Pine Creek Road in November 2004, which destroyed a residential structure so thoroughly no remains were ever recovered. Though neighbors had testified that the man living there was quiet, odd, made things out of wood, used to work at the children's hospital before it shut down. And when Leo cross-referenced that name with old newspaper scans, he found a yellowed article from 1989 showing a photo of a workshop table cluttered with wooden limbs and prosthetic molds. Captioned, Howard Elwha, master craftsman, prepares experimental child-sized joints for pediatric use. The photo chilled him not because of the tools or the expressionless mannequins in the background, but because in the lower corner, the connection was no longer circumstantial. The pattern was too intricate, too intentional, and Leo sat alone in his rented studio apartment in Portland, staring at his wall of scribbled notes and printed screenshots and pinned photographs. And that night, when the static returned not on a TV, but on his laptop screen, pulsing like a living thing, he didn't scream or unplug it or call anyone for help, because he already understood the truth. What began as a restless search through message boards and archival dead ends, an obsessive late night ritual fed by sleeplessness and static-soaked paranoia, suddenly took a turn the moment Leo stumbled across an obscure subforum, buried deep within a deprecated platform used mostly by amateur archivists and urban exploration hobbyists, where someone had made a post at 3:17 a.m. under the username ZOR4X with the cryptic title, "Did anyone else watch their own version of Workshop 81?" A thread that, unlike the usual fictional nostalgia bait, felt eerily sincere from the first line, as if the person writing it wasn't trying to entertain or embellish, but that each of these broadcasts had occurred in completely different locations, With every post wiped, every comment thread collapsed into blank space, and the photos too, vanished as if they'd been scrubbed from the server's memory itself, leaving behind only an error message that didn't quite make sense. Asset corrupted. Broadcast terminated. And in that moment, Leo felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a cold awareness, as though the act of seeing had marked him again, as if his mere curiosity had been enough to trigger some ancient circuit buried deep within whatever force had once spoken through Channel 81, and now it had turned its attention back toward him. With different hosts, different set designs, different names, but with unmistakably similar themes and the same twisted, pedagogical tone of something pretending to educate while slowly unmaking the boundaries between play and ritual, between creation and possession. And then there was the user named Toymaker Echo, who uploaded a series of low-resolution photos showing a handmade puppet supposedly received after mailing a letter to a PO box advertised at the end of their version of the show back in 1994. A puppet that bore an eerie resemblance to the toy Leo had drawn in crayon and mailed out as part of a contest run by Workshop 81 when he was 9. A figure with disproportionate arms and 3 black buttons down the chest. And it wasn't just the design that chilled him, but the stitching along its collar, where the name Leo had been sewn in crude red thread, exactly as he remembered scrawling it 2 decades ago on the envelope now lost to time or something worse. But to offload something too heavy to carry alone. And as Leo scrolled through replies that multiplied with quiet desperation, he realized this was no isolated hallucination born of childhood trauma, but something larger, wider, stranger, because the stories began to echo each other with uncanny precision, not in wording or exact detail, but in tone, texture, and the same sickening sense of being watched through glass, of having once been seen by something behind the camera that wasn't supposed to exist, or at least not supposed to remain. There was a woman from northern Idaho who recalled, with breathless unease, a local UHF channel 12.5, she said, though no such thing existed, where a show aired for only 6 Sundays during the summer of '97, featuring a thin man in wooden suspenders teaching children how to carve toys that looked exactly like themselves, and how she received one of those dolls weeks later in the mail, despite never submitting her address to anything, and how she buried it in her backyard after waking up to find it had moved from her shelf to her pillow one night, its arms arranged to cover its own painted eyes. A man from Quebec writing in slow broken English recalled a program titled L'Atelier de Minuit that appeared only during thunderstorms on his grandmother's basement TV, where masked figures whispered instructions while crafting limbs from something that didn't quite look like wood. And how to this day he could still hum the theme music, though every attempt to recreate it ended in distorted frequencies or audio corruption, as if the melody refused to be recorded or remembered too clearly. A group of now-grown teenagers from a suburb near Albuquerque claimed they watched a Saturday night puppet show hosted by the Glue Father, who taught them how to build friends who didn't blink and always smiled, and who in one unaired finale they swore had played only once removed his mask to reveal a face with no eyes and a mouth that opened sideways before everything cut to static and their VCR refused to eject the tape for 3 days. What chilled Leo most wasn't just the consistency in their recollections or the matching emotional residue of unresolved terror. He stared at the images for a long time, his hands cold, despite the hum of the radiator, and considered reaching out to the poster, just a brief message, something simple asking where they got the doll. But when he clicked on their username, the account was gone, not suspended or deleted, but as if it had never existed at all. The call came just past noon on a Wednesday, the kind of gray, unremarkable day that made Leo question whether his descent into the depths of Workshop 81 was a path he had chosen, or one that had always been laid out for him, heart pounding with a mixture of journalistic anticipation and a deeper dread he no longer tried to deny. And by the time he stepped through the shattered stairwell into the dim belly of the hospital's lowest floor, the wallpaper patterned with shapes that curled away like peeling flesh, the toy chest overflowing with hand-stitched dolls whose faces bore subtly symmetries that grew more disturbing the longer he looked, and in the far corner, and more than one bore human elements that defied any comforting explanation, real teeth and two small jaws, single eyes preserved in resin but unmistakably human, fabric sewn from what Leo refused to consider skin, knees buckling under the weight of something he couldn't process, a kind of terror that wasn't sudden or sharp but ancient and thick, like syrup poured into his lungs. And as his vision narrowed and the cold air rose around him like water, the last thing he remembered was the sound of the tape continuing to play, even after the screen went dark, as if the broadcast had never ended, but had merely been waiting for him to return, for him to witness, for him to finally remember that he had never truly left. And behind the filming rig, set against the closet door, he found a monitor still connected to a looping reel, one that played back grainy footage of a child sleeping fitfully in bed. And it wasn't until Leo leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding like it was trying to escape his chest, that he recognized the room in the video not as a set, but as his own childhood bedroom, every corner identical, every drawer and shelf in its exact remembered place, lit by a single ceiling bulb that still flickered to life when someone touched the switch stood. A bookshelf filled not with stories of voyeuristic gaze from the darkness behind the slats. And as the boy in the footage shifted slightly, mumbling something that might have been "no more," a small shape moved at the edge of the frame, a doll crawling with impossible fluidity across the floor and climbing onto the bed, its head tilting toward the lens at the last second to reveal painted lips, twitching as if mouthing words that could not be heard, but were clearly meant to be felt. But with tapes, hundreds of VHS cassettes labeled in black marker with names and dates, some faded to near illegibility, others smudged as though by small fingers trembling in fear. Flanked by two uneasy maintenance workers who kept glancing at each other like they'd rather be anywhere else, Leo had already decided not to tell them what he suspected. Not to explain that the thing they'd found might be the epicenter of something that had shaped the entire course of his life since childhood. Because how could he even begin to explain that the hum in the walls was familiar, that the distant click of water through corroded pipes sounded too much like the rhythmic tapping of puppet joints against old wood, or that the air smelled not of mold or dust, but of varnish and melted plastic and the faint, unmistakable sharpness of blood. And when the woman from the Kettle Hill Historical Society told him, almost offhandedly, that a crew doing structural work under the remains of the old children hospital had broken through a false wall, revealing a corridor no one had ever documented. A passage sealed in concrete and silence for what might have been decades, he felt. A cold ripple moved down his spine, not from the content of the words, but from the tone in which they were delivered, like someone mentioning a misplaced file cabinet, when what they had actually found was something that had been meant to stay buried. He drove out that same day, cameras packed. The corridor itself was no wider than a service shaft barely lit by temporary work lamps strung overhead, the kind that swung slightly when someone walked too close and cast flickering shadows like restless silhouettes along the concrete walls, and at the far end stood a reinforced steel door with no handle, no signage. Nothing but a thin crack in the seam, just enough to suggest it had once opened from the inside, and when the workers finally pried it open with crowbars and an expletive-laced effort, the smell that emerged was enough to make the younger man gag, while the older one muttered a prayer Leo didn't recognize. And yet all he could do was film, record, document every inch of what lay beyond, though part of him already wished he hadn't. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply, as if the room had been sealed not just from space, but from time itself. And under layers of disturbed dust and cobwebs was what could only be described as a crude studio set, constructed with obsessive care to resemble a child's bedroom, but something was always off the bed too small. The walls had shelves lined with malformed puppets in various stages of completion. some clearly carved, others constructed from repurposed organic material. And then he saw himself, 9 years old and sound asleep, curled under his favorite blanket with the dinosaur print, while the camera placed from inside the closet recorded silently, unblinking. Leo didn't scream, didn't drop the camera, didn't flee, he simply collapsed. When Leo opened his eyes, the world around him felt misaligned, as though his consciousness had returned a few inches off-center from where it was supposed to land. And for a long moment, he couldn't tell if the sterile ceiling above him belonged to a hospital or the final layer of some waking nightmare that refused to let him go, especially as the sound he first registered wasn't the rhythmic beep of heart monitors or the shuffle of nurses' shoes, but a soft, until he was alone with the cold blue wash of a flickering overhead light, and then hesitantly, as if performing a ritual, he opened the file, knowing full well what was waiting on the other side. Brushing away a curl of wood from its face, Leo's breath caught in his throat because it wasn't just any doll he was holding, but a replica of Leo himself, down to the exact hairline, the mole under the left eye, the scar on his chin from falling off a bike when he was 7, all rendered with such grotesque precision that for a moment Leo forgot how to move. Because even before the screen lit up, before the audio kicked in, he could feel it pressing against his chest, like a hand that had known the shape of his ribs for years. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than Leo remembered, but unmistakable in its cadence, measured, theatrical, with that faint sing-song edge that once might have thrilled a child, but now drilled directly into the spine of a man who had spent 2 decades trying to forget. And he said, "I had to start over, Leo. The others, they were rough drafts. You were always the favorite. This one though, this one looks just like you." Melodic humming that pulsed just at the edge of hearing, familiar yet disfigured, like a lullaby someone had listened to too many times and now replayed backward out of spite. Every wall lined with toys and tools and jars of things that looked too real to be props. And as the Toymaker set the Leo doll down beside another unfinished, faceless, waiting, he reached for the switch mounted to the wall. The one that had always turned on the signal, and without turning toward the lens, he whispered, "The broadcast begins again." They told him he'd been found in the basement of the old hospital, unconscious, unresponsive, curled into the fetal position like a child trying to disappear into his own spine, whispering a song no one could recognize but that left one of the interns crying in the hallway without explanation. And although they ran tests and checked vitals and gave him fluids, no one could tell him how long he'd been down there or why, nor could they explain why the battery on his phone was still full when it had been missing for days, or why, when they handed it back to him, it contained a video file timestamped just 2 hours prior, though the building had been sealed and the lights cut since the night of his collapse. Leo waited until the nurses left the room, until the sounds of life resumed in the hallway. The footage began in silence blackness, slowly giving way to the pale amber glow of workshop. 81 though, this time it wasn't ruined or buried or scorched, but pristine, perfectly lit, as if the fire had never happened and time had never passed. As if the world outside had held its breath for 20 years just to preserve this one hidden. Room for a final broadcast, and there at the center, hunched over the workbench in the soft halo of a single lamp, sat the Toymaker, his movements precise and unhurried, carving something from dark wood with tools that gleamed like surgical instruments. There was no music, no voiceover, no theatrics, just the sound of the blade scraping, the whisper of sandpaper, the occasional creak of a stool shifting under his weight. And when he finally lifted the object into view, then the Toymaker looked up, and though the mask covered his face as always, something in the way he tilted his head suggested recognition, affection even. The camera pulled back slowly, revealing the workshop in full, every surface meticulously arranged. Then, with a gentle flick of his fingers, the red light on the camera blinked to life. "Channel 81 is open." Leo thought he could outpace it, that if he reduced the tapes to ash, scattered the plastic remnants to the wind, deleted the files from every known device, replaced hard Drives destroyed routers and isolated himself in a cabin without electricity, but when parents across Kettle Hill began reporting that their children were waking up screaming about a man with no eyes, who offered them toys that smelled like rot, when school counselors received drawings of masked figures hunched over bleeding wooden dolls labeled Leo's brother or Jamie Lives below, and when a local technician posted a photo of Channel 81 mysteriously activating on a vintage CRT television that hadn't have functioned since 1999, displaying the workshop in real time, with the Toymaker staring directly into the lens and mouthing something that synced perfectly with the viewer's heartbeat. Leo realized it was no longer confined to him, warped at the edges like it couldn't quite decide what to reflect, and saw not the face he remembered, not the exhausted man with the hollow eyes, but the outline of something newly formed, something shaped by wood and lacquer and the soft creak of limbs designed to move on strings. And it was then, as the lines of his jaw sharpened and his skin seemed to gloss and stretch in unnatural ways, that Leo finally understood the cruel elegance of the Toymaker's plan. Perhaps the loop would falter, hesitate, and eventually dissolve into memory. But no amount of fire, no depth of burial, no digital cleansing could unbind him from what had already embedded itself, far deeper than magnetic tape or carbon wire. But curiosity still pulled him like a puppet string toward the single line inside. You were never watching. You were the broadcast. Because the footage always returned, not merely as files or pixels, but as presence, bleeding through untouched DVDs surfacing in folderless directories, overwriting weather reports on analog radios, and in one particularly cruel instance flashing on the baby monitor of a neighbor's child during a thunderstorm, the image of a puppet stitched with Leo's name across its chest, swaying gently to a lullaby that hadn't been aired for 2 decades. He tried to ignore it, to attribute each reappearance to nerves, to lack of sleep, to the kind of creeping madness that comes from living too long with unresolved trauma. It had spread. And when he opened his inbox one final time, not expecting much more than static, the absence of a sender or subject should have been a warning. The words didn't register at first, not fully, not until he looked into the mirror hanging in the hallway, an antique thing that once belonged to his grandmother. He hadn't been haunted, he'd been carved. And now the loop wasn't just broadcasting, it was becoming.